I never thought my own daughter would be the one to hand me a cup of coffee, sit across from me at my own kitchen table, and tell me she was putting me in a home. Not asking, telling. I was 63 years old. I'd spent 31 years driving a delivery truck for a regional freight company out of Columbus, Ohio. Woke up at 4:30 every morning, 6 days a week, came home smelling like diesel and warehouse dust, and I never once complained because that job paid the mortgage, kept the lights on, and put my daughter Iris through 4 years at Ohio State. She graduated with a business degree and a fiancé whose family owned 3 car dealerships in the greater Columbus area. His name was Brock, and from the first time I shook his hand, I could tell he thought I was furniture. That morning, Iris had driven over unannounced. That should have been my first warning. She never came by without texting first, not since she and Brock got married and moved out to their house in Dublin, the kind of suburb where every lawn looks like a golf course and people have strong opinions about which pressure washing company to use. I was still in my robe, drinking my first cup, watching the morning news, when she let herself in with her spare key. She was dressed for work, blazer and heels, and she set a bakery bag on the counter like she was making an effort. "Dad," she said, and I knew right then something was coming. She'd been talking to Brock's mother, apparently. They'd done some research. There was a place out in Westerville, she said, very nice. A senior living community, not a nursing home. She was careful to say that, as if the distinction was going to make me feel better. They had a waiting list, but Brock's family knew someone and they could get me in by February. I asked her what on earth she was talking about. She said I was getting older, that the house was too much for one person, that she worried about me alone out here, that it made more sense financially to sell the property and use the equity toward the facility costs. She said it all very quickly, like she'd rehearsed it, like she was presenting a proposal at work. I told her I was 63, not 90. I still drove. I still walked 4 miles every morning. I'd replaced the gutters myself the previous fall. She said it wasn't about capability, it was about planning ahead. Then I asked the question I should have asked first. Whose idea was this? She looked down at her coffee. Iris, Brock thinks the property value is at a peak right now, and that if we wait, there it is, I said. The house wasn't fancy. It was a 3-bedroom colonial on a half-acre out in Hilliard that I'd bought with my ex-wife Barbara in 1989. Barbara and I had divorced when Iris was 11, and I'd kept the house because I needed something to stay in place. I'd paid it off in full by the time I was 58. In this market, I knew it was worth somewhere around $400,000, maybe more. Brock had done the math and apparently didn't like how that number was just sitting there in my name. I told Iris to go to work. She cried a little. Said I was being unfair. Said she was just trying to look out for me. I told her I understood exactly what she was doing and walked her to the door. That was on a Thursday in October. By Sunday, I'd replayed that conversation about 40 times, and I still didn't know what to do with it. Not the rage, I knew what to do with that. I'd learned a long time ago that rage without direction just rots you from the inside. What I didn't know what to do with was the loneliness underneath it, because the truth was, Iris wasn't entirely wrong about one thing. The house was quiet, had been for years. I retired from the freight company at 61, a year after my knees started arguing with me about the truck steps, and retirement had turned out to be a lot lonelier than the brochures suggested. My buddy Dale had moved to Arizona to be near his grandkids. My friend Ted had died of a heart attack at 62, and that still didn't feel real. I had neighbors I waved to, and a bowling league I dropped out of when my back flared up, and that was about it. On Monday morning, I drove to the hardware store in Hilliard just to have somewhere to go. I was standing in the plumbing aisle looking at pipe fittings. I didn't need when a man about my age stopped next to me and looked at the same fittings with the same expression I probably had. You actually need these, he said, or are you just here to feel useful? I laughed for the first time in 4 days. Second one. He put out his hand. Nolan Ray, I said. Raymond was on my birth certificate, but nobody had called me that since my mother. Nolan Hurst was 68, a retired civil engineer from the city of Columbus, and he had the kind of face that made you think he'd seen most things and found them mildly amusing. He was lean, wore a canvas jacket that had paint stains on one sleeve, and carried himself like a man who was comfortable taking up space. We ended up getting coffee at the diner across the parking lot and talking for 2 hours. He'd lost his wife 4 years earlier, he said. Aneurysm, sudden, no warning. They'd been married 40 years. He had 2 sons, one in Seattle and one in Denver, both of whom called on holidays and birthdays and meant well and were nonetheless essentially strangers at this point. You learn to fill your own times, he said. It's an acquired skill. Some days I'm better at it than others. I told him about Iris and what had happened Thursday. I'm not sure why. I'm not usually someone who unloads on a person I've known for 20 minutes. But something about the way he listened made it easy. He didn't jump in with advice. He just listened. When I finished, he said, "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet." "That's honest." He nodded. "At least you're not pretending you're fine." We exchanged numbers before we left. I thought it would be one of those things where you say you'll keep in touch and then you don't, but he texted that evening to say he'd found a pub quiz in Grandview on Wednesdays if I was interested, and I was surprised to find that I was. Over the next 3 weeks, Nolan Hurst became the most unexpected thing in my life. We went to the pub quiz, which we were bad at but enjoyed. We drove out to Antietam one weekend because he'd been meaning to visit the battlefield for years, and I'd never been. We spent a Saturday afternoon recalking his bathroom because he'd started the project and then realized he hated doing it alone. I found out during that bathroom project that Nolan had done well for himself, not in an obvious way. He drove a sensible 10-year-old Subaru and bought his jeans at Costco, but there were small things. The house in Bexley, which is one of the nicer neighborhoods in Columbus, the quiet mention of a financial advisor he met with quarterly, the way he talked about his property in West Virginia, 50 acres on a river, bought decades ago when land was cheap, without any particular pride, just as a fact. I didn't ask about his finances. It wasn't my business. But I noticed one Wednesday evening in November, Nolan got quiet over his beer in a way that was different from his usual quiet. His usual quiet was settled, comfortable. This was something else. I asked him if he was all right. He looked at his glass for a moment. "My son called today. Donovan, the one in Denver, and he wants me to think about getting my affairs in order." Nolan said it flatly. He used that exact phrase, getting your affairs in order. Like I'm a filing cabinet. "How old are you again?" 68. "That's not exactly your affairs in order age," I said. "No," he said, "unless someone thinks there's something to be ordered." He didn't say anything else about it that night, but I thought about it on the drive home. Donovan called monthly, from what I'd gathered. He and his brother Elliot had grown up with money, the good schools, the comfortable house, the trips to Europe. All the things Nolan had worked his career to provide, and now, apparently, one of them was starting to think about what happened next. The following week, Nolan called me on a Tuesday morning, which was unusual. "I need a favor," he said. "It might be a strange one. We met for breakfast." He looked tired, which was also unusual for him. He wrapped his hands around his coffee mug and told me the situation. Donovan was flying in from Denver on Thursday. He'd been calling more frequently, nudging conversations towards estate planning, toward what Nolan wanted done with the West Virginia property, toward the Bexley house. Nolan's lawyer, a man named Pfeiffer, who Nolan had worked with for 30 years, had noticed the pattern too and had mentioned it to Nolan quietly. "Donovan's not a bad person," Nolan said, and I could hear that he meant it and that it cost him something to qualify it. But he's got a certain way of thinking about things. Very transactional. He's been talking to his brother about it, and they've got opinions about what should happen to the estate, and they've been having those conversations without me. Which I know because Elliot told me accidentally on a call last month. What do you want to do about it? Nolan looked at me. I want to see how Donovan behaves when he thinks things might not go the way he's planned. Meaning, he said slowly, that I want you to come to dinner Thursday night and let me introduce you as an old friend, someone I've known for years, someone I've been helping get back on his feet. I waited. I want to mention in conversation that I've been thinking about updating my will. I looked at him for a long moment. You want to shake the tree? I want to see what falls out, he said. I know it sounds dramatic, but I've watched Donovan's calls change over the last year. The questions he asks now, the way he brings up the West Virginia land every third conversation. I love my son. I just want to know who I'm dealing with before I sign anything. I told him I wasn't comfortable pretending to be something I wasn't. I'm not asking you to lie, he said. I'm asking you to come to dinner. You're my friend. That's true. Let me handle the rest. There was something in how he said it that I recognized, the same tired clarity I'd felt after Iris's visit, the feeling of seeing something you wished you didn't see and having to decide what to do with it. I'll come to dinner, I said. Donovan Hurst was 41, tall like his father, with expensive haircut and the polished ease of someone who'd spent years in client-facing work. He shook my hand firmly when we met in Nolan's living room. Thursday evening, smiled the right amount, asked the right questions about how I knew his dad, how long we'd been friends. I said we met a few months back and had become close quickly. All true. Donovan's wife wasn't with him. She'd stayed in Denver with their kids. It was just the three of us for dinner, which Nolan had cooked himself. Short ribs, roasted vegetables, the kind of meal that took most of the day, and that Nolan had mentioned that morning without making a big deal of it. He was that kind of man. Over dinner, the conversation was easy at first. Donovan asked about the Antietam trip, about the pub quiz, and I could see him recalibrating as we talked, adjusting his read of the situation, trying to figure out what I was and what I meant. Then Nolan said, casually, the way he said most things, Ray's going through a rough patch right now. Daughter's been pressuring him to sell his house. I've been helping him sort through his options. Donovan looked at me. That's a tough situation. It is, I said. Your father's been a good sounding board, I added. He has a way of putting things in perspective. Donovan smiled, and it was a good smile, but I watched his eyes move to his father after I said it, a quick calculation, quick as a blink. A little while later, clearing dishes, Donovan said, Dad, I actually wanted to talk to you while I'm here about the property in West Virginia. I spoke with a land broker a few weeks ago, just casually, and the numbers in that area have really moved. Nolan said, I think it might be worth talking to Pfeiffer about how it fits into the overall picture. The tax situation alone, I've been thinking about updating the will actually, Nolan said, and the table went very quiet. Donovan set down the dish he was holding. Oh, I've been doing some thinkings about legacy. What I actually want to leave behind versus what just goes to whoever. Nolan poured more wine. I've been talking to Ray about it, actually. He's had a similar reckoning with his own situation. Donovan looked at me again. This time the calculation wasn't quick. It settled. Of course, Donovan said, and his voice had shifted. Not much, a few degrees, like a temperature drop you feel before you see your breath. Whatever you decide, Dad. After dinner, Nolan made decaf and the three of us sat in the living room. Donovan was smoother than Thomas in the story I'd told myself about how these evenings went. He didn't bluster or threaten. He was measured. He asked thoughtful questions about what Nolan wanted his legacy to be, what values he wanted to center in his giving. It was almost impressive. But twice during that conversation, when Nolan left the room, once for coffee, once to find a book he wanted to show me, Donovan said things that told me everything. The first time, how long have you actually known my dad? I told him the truth, a few months. He can be generous to a fault, Donovan said. I say that with love. He just trusts easily. The second time Nolan stepped out, Donovan said, I hope you understand that our family has a long history here. There are things that have been expected for a long time. I didn't say anything to that. I just looked at him until he looked away. After Donovan left, Nolan and I sat in his kitchen for a while. He seemed worn out in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Well, he said. Yeah, I said. He's my son, he said, and there was nothing defensive about it, just the plain weight of the fact. I know. I remember teaching him to ride a bike in the driveway of our old house on Bryden Road. He was so mad every time he fell, wouldn't cry, just got back up and glared at the bike like it had insulted him. Nolan smiled at something far away. He was 7. I thought about Iris the morning she'd sat at my kitchen table with her bakery bag and her rehearsed speech. I thought about how I'd watched her learn to read at that same table, how she used to fall asleep in the truck on late Saturday errands, and I'd carry her inside still buckled in her car seat because I didn't want to wake her. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I'm going to take my time," he said. "I'm not going to be rushed, and I'm going to be honest with both of them about what I saw tonight." He paused. "And I'm going to remember what you told me last week." I tried to remember what I'd said last week. What I say? You said the worst part wasn't the anger. The worst part was when you realized your kid had become someone you didn't entirely recognize and you couldn't figure out how much of that was your fault. I had said that. It was true. "You're a good listener," Nolan said. "You know that?" My ex-wife would disagree. He laughed. It broke the weight of the room a little. I drove home that night thinking about what Donovan had said about his father trusting easily. Said with love, he'd claimed. I thought about the way people wrap their self-interest in the language of concern and convince themselves the wrapping is the thing. Over the following weeks, Nolan had 2 more conversations with Donovan, honest ones, in which he told his son directly what he'd observed and what it had made him feel. He told me about them afterwards, sitting in his kitchen over the coffee he always had ready. Donovan hadn't taken it well at first. There had been defensiveness, then silence, then a long email that was part apology and part justification. "It's a process," Nolan said. "I'm not expecting it to be clean." I understood that. Iris and I had been having our own version of that process. She'd called 2 weeks after the kitchen table conversation, not to apologize exactly, but to say that she'd been thinking about what I'd said, and that Brock had been pushing harder than she was comfortable with, and that she was sorry for bringing it to me the way it was something. It wasn't everything I wanted to hear, but it was something. Nolan updated his will in December. He told me about it matter-of-factly one Wednesday over post-quiz drinks. The West Virginia property was going into a conservation easement. The Bexley house decided would go equally to his sons, with enough cash set aside to cover its maintenance for several years so they couldn't be pressured to sell quickly. He'd also set up a small foundation to support engineering scholarships at his alma mater, Purdue. He paused after telling me all that and said, "I also made a change on your behalf." I told him I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "It's not the house," he said, smiling. "Don't panic. I have a place out in Licking County, 12 acres, an old farmhouse I've been meaning to fix up for 15 years. It's been sitting empty. I want you to have use of it. Live there if you want, rent-free, for as long as you want. Fix it up if you feel like it. Leave it alone if you don't." I stared at him. "Nolan, you're the only person in my life right now who treats me like a person instead of an asset," he said. "A 12-acre farm in Licking County is the least I can do." I started to say no the way you do when someone offers you something you know you need. He cut me off. "It's already done legally. You can waste your breath arguing, or you can come look at it this weekend." We drove out on a Saturday in January, down routes I half remembered from a camping trip I'd taken years ago with Barbara, and a 4-year-old Iris who asked questions the entire drive. The farm was at the end of a gravel lane, an old 2-story with white paint that had mostly given up, and a porch that needed its boards replaced, and 12 acres of field and woodline that in January looked cold and spare and exactly like something I hadn't known I was looking for. I stood there in the frozen grass and felt something I hadn't felt since I was a much younger man facing a much different kind of uncertainty. Not hope exactly, something quieter, the sense that the next thing was still open. Porch needs work, I said. It does, Nolan agreed. I've replaced worse. I was counting on that. I moved out to the farm in March. I sold the Hillier suppline to buyers I chose for a price that made Brock's dealership math irrelevant. I used some of it to fix the farmhouse roof and put new windows in and replace that porch. I kept the rest. It was enough. Iris came out to see the place in April on a Sunday afternoon when the fields were just starting to show green. She walked around with her hands in her jacket pockets and didn't say much for a while. Then she asked me if I was happy here. I told her I was getting there. She said she was sorry, a real apology, not a managed one. She said she'd let Brock's way of thinking about things crowd out her own for too long and that she knew she had work to do on that. I believed her. Not because she said the right words, but because I know my daughter, and she was standing in a field on a Sunday afternoon instead of at a brunch with her in-laws, which told me the apology was costing her something. I told her we'd figure it out. One Sunday at a time, Nolan came out to the farm most weekends that spring and summer. We fixed fencing, cut back the overgrown tree line on the south field, argued about the correct way to hang a door. He was wrong, and ate dinner on the new porch more evenings than I could count. His relationship with Donovan was still in progress, still complicated, but they'd had a trip together in the spring, just the two of them, a week in Montana that Donovan had suggested and Nolan had said yes to without overanalyzing it. He's not a bad person, Nolan said again one evening on the porch. Still meaning it, still it costing him something. No, I said, just a person. That's the thing nobody warns you about when you get older. The people who complicate your life are rarely villains. They're mostly just regular people, your kids, your ex-wife, your son-in-law with his spreadsheets, who've let one way of thinking about the world narrow everything else out, and sometimes all it takes is someone showing them the view from a different angle. I still think about that Tuesday morning in the plumbing aisle sometimes, how close I came to just buying the fittings I didn't need and going home. How I almost didn't laugh at what Nolan said. How the whole of what came after was balanced on that one ordinary morning when two men with nothing particular to do ended up getting coffee because neither one of them wanted to go home yet. I'm 64 now. The porch is solid. The south field I rented out to a neighbor's kid who runs cattle, and watching them move across the grass in the early morning has turned out to be one of the better things I've found in this chapter of my life. Iris brings her boys out every few weeks, and they have strong opinions about the cattle and my dog, a hound I got in September who is useless at everything, except sitting in exactly the right place when you need him to. Nolan was out here 2 weeks ago, and we sat on the porch until the sun went all the way down, which takes a long time in June, and neither of us felt any particular need to fill it with words. That's how you know you've found the right kind of company, not when they make the silence louder, but when they make it comfortable enough that you can finally hear yourself think.